So hi everybody, welcome to this Prometheus-X Unveiled technical workshop. I'll start with a small recap and introduction on Prometheus-X and what we do for those that don't know, and then I'll hand over to my friends and colleagues Laszlo and Felix for the more technical deep dive into the overall architecture, but also into the main and core components Felix will be presenting. So quickly on Prometheus-X, if Laszlo, you can share the next slide, please. What we are doing is we are providing open source components that we call building blocks for data spaces. We're working on 20 of such components that help and facilitate data transactions in data spaces. So we'll go over them, but there are 19 partners and organizations that work and develop them. To make them work together, but also to have the best quality as those are in a sense, companies that have been working for a while on such technologies and that are now coming together to form one single stack. One important, let's say, differentiation and focus we have is on personal data sharing and how can we enable, let's say, GDPR compliant personal data sharing in data spaces. And we do that by offering a personal data intermediary to people as a tool to control their data in data spaces. And parts of this will be explained a bit later on. We are working with about 200 organizations across Europe and a bit abroad as well, with some organizations in the US and in South Korea that are using these components to set up their own data spaces and use cases in different domains, such as skills, tourism, smart cities. And Prometheus-X is a non-profit, so it's an organization, a legal entity that governs and funds this infrastructure. If we go to the next slide, just to show quickly the different set of partners we have. I won't go into details, but we have a lot in skills where we can find universities, training organizations, employers, edtech, HR techs working on skills data space use cases. We won't go this time into the detail of use cases because we have other webinars that are more focused on the use cases, and today we focus more on the technical components. We have also partners in the tourism data space, so different travel agencies, travel services, and partners in the smart cities domain. So a lot of important organizations that are using and starting to deploy these components to build different data space use cases. How it, where we position ourselves is that Prometheus-X is not a platform. It does not operate or offer these components as a service. Prometheus-X is really on the open source layer and governs these the technical choices and how these components work together. All these components are based on different data space specifications. So as you know, probably Gaia-X, IDSA, DSSC are working on glossaries, protocols, trust models, and so on for data spaces. So we take that into compliance in a sense, and of course with the different EU regulations, GDPR, Data Governance Act, and so on. And so Prometheus-X offers a series of these open source components that, in a sense, each data space needs. And then the different data spaces can take these components and operate them through providers or directly themselves. So here we represent on the picture data intermediaries, because usually and under the Data Governance Act, when an organization provides these services to a data space, it becomes a data intermediary. And so in a sense, these components help these data intermediaries being set up, but also help interoperability across data intermediaries, so as to connect different data spaces, different ecosystems together. If we go to the next one. And now, yes, this was the general introduction to show you a bit what our goal is, who are mainly our partners, and what we provide from a high-level perspective. The goal of this workshop is to show you a bit more technically what is planned and how the core components that are already available work, and how you can easily start using them. And hopefully, we would like to include you in our community if you want to test them, use them, or contribute to them. And all of that will be unveiled in this webinar. And up to you, Laszlo.
Thank you. So I'm Laszlo Gunci from BME Budapest, and I'd like to summarize briefly the Prometheus-X architecture and development, and where we are and how we are progressing with creating all of these building blocks. So basically, the project has a focus on creating open source blocks which you can use to build your own data space, which can be configured across according to different requirements, and without dependency on a concrete infrastructural solution. And of course, as Matthias mentioned, we have a strong focus on the personal data and the evaluation of trustworthiness all over this data space and the data sharing scenarios. And for this, I'd like to briefly present the overall architecture, the blocks we are creating. And then Felix will present the core blocks needed to set up the data space. And we also will see how these are actually working. So this is the architecture shown by Matthias as well. And from this architecture, we have blocks which are already available. You will see some of these blocks today, right? And then we have a number of blocks which we are developing in the frame of the Edge project, and they would be available by most of them by the end of the year. Some of them will be available sooner as well. So if we go a bit deeper on what they are, there are these building blocks. We have available specifications. So if you are interested, you can check both the more business level and the more technical specification of these blocks. We are now creating so-called data space enabling services, which would be a combination of these blocks, which helps to set up data sharing scenarios. We are doing it with different data sources and different scenarios like skills data sharing, educational data sharing, sharing VR traces, and also the project has a support for the decentralized training of AI models to support the privacy-preserving AI training. So if we have a look on the main architectural blocks, there are the core blocks. These would be presented now today. These are the ones which are needed to actually operate the data space. These would be presented by Felix after my presentation. Then we have a number of blocks which concentrate on how the overall data sharing and data processing and also the algorithms operating over data are trustworthy. We have a component for the decentralized training of AI models, which helps the scalable and privacy-preserving training of AI models right on the data of the user without sending confidential or private data to a third party. We support this with AI processing block, which runs at the edge and at the site of the end user if needed. We have a block which offers multiple services for evaluation of AI algorithms, both at design and runtime, to evaluate their trustworthiness. And these components together support the data sharing, the setup of trustworthy and privacy-preserving data sharing scenarios. We have then a number of blocks which concentrate on the transformation and processing of different types of data. We have a component which can transform data across different learning management systems, so it can make the analysis services independent from the concrete data representation and the learning management systems which are used in different organizations. We have a component which supports the individual user to store their own educational and learning data. And then, of course, to use it for later analysis, for instance. We have a component which supports the privacy-preserving analytics of learning activities. Another one which supports the unified analysis of different learning activities by offering crowd tagging opportunity for different learning data. We have another component which will process large amount of data and transform it to a way that it would be easier to share and process and analyze it. We have a component which will transform and manage skills data on an ontological basis and helps to support and map data across different countries, different formats, different representations. We have a component which will concentrate on analysis and processing of VR learning traces. And these components together support the educational and skills data processing and analysis. And we have a number of components which are independent from the concrete domain, which are supporting the data space and support the business model and the operation of the data space. We have a component which is called the data value chain tracker, which helps to create business model and trace the data, how it's being used within a data space, and set up different business scenarios and collaborations based on the value and the usage of this data. We have another component, which is the data veracity assurance, which will evaluate the quality of the data, not only the user data or the data provided to the data space, but also the data which is provided by these building blocks internally within these service chains. We have a component which focuses on data visualization and does it in a way that it's, again, privacy preserving. So it's a distributed visualization component. And these components help to generally operate the data space. And what we are doing now is we put together now different so-called data space enabling services, which are combinations of these blocks supporting specific configuration of a data sharing scenario. What are these configuration or decision points for a data sharing scenario? Is, for instance, the number and the role of different organizations which are being involved in this scenario, whether there is a need, for instance, to perform anonymization services, what type of input data we are processing, and there are a number of additional requirements. And these together help to define different combinations, different chains of this block, which supports the operation of the data space. We are now working on these chains, and we plan to have a workshop in September, which will more concentrate on complex scenarios, which use a combination of these different building blocks. But now, for today, I would like to pass the floor to Felix Bohr, who will present the core components of the Prometheus data space blocks.
All right, thank you, Laszlo. I'll take over the screen share. Okay, so hi everybody. So first off, just a quick presentation of myself. So I'm Felix. I work as the CTO of Visions, which has been taking part in subjects of these kinds regarding data exchange in data spaces and more specifically consent management. And we've been working on Prometheus-X since the start of the project, especially on the building blocks regarding consent management, but also contract and catalog, some of which I'll be presenting today. I'll pass this slide because you've seen it 2 times already in the presentations, so you know what it's about. But I'll start by saying that what Prometheus-X aims for in terms of standardization in respect of different standards and processes and protocols that are defined out there. So Prometheus-X is a kind of a fusion of ideas and principles that Gaia-X and IDSA are defining, such as the protocols, the standards that are used, and the description of entities within these groups. So, for instance, in a more specific way, from Gaia-X, we are basing a lot of our work on what they use as a trust framework that is defining some important entities in the data spaces, such as how data resources are declared, how services are defined, how software resources are defined, service offerings, participants, etc. And all of these schemas and data models are defined to power basically the way we define things in the catalog, in the contract services as well, but in the data space in general. And from IDSA, we have a different approach in that we are taking inspiration from the different protocols and standards that they are defining in the IDS Dataspace protocol specification. And so this includes protocols such as the catalog protocol, contract protocol, the different kinds of transfer process that is being defined in there, and all of the different standards that are defined. So for instance, DCAT for catalog, or ODRL for the different policies on access and usage control on the resources that are exchanged within the dataspace. From IDS, we also took inspiration from supported IDS policy classes that are ODRL policies to directly support them in the Prometheus-X environments. So this is one of the other things that we took from IDSA. But essentially, Prometheus-X is trying to work towards having this alignment with all of these principles that are defined and have been defined for a while in these groups. So let's get started. So I'm just quickly going to go over this image because we'll have the chance to go over each component later on. But this shows what we're going to talk about today and where they basically sit in the architecture. So at the top, you see there is a layer for standardization governance, basically, where Prometheus-X is going to be defining some reference models, what we call reference models, which are templates for different rules, different roles that participants can have in data space, but also some pricing models, business models, the policy templates that can be reused throughout the data space very easily across the different infrastructure services. And so on the layer of the infrastructure services, there are the three components we're going to talk about today, which are catalog, contract, and consent, which are the three that are essential to have basically first the data exchange happen in a data space environment. So from this infrastructure layer, you can see that there's the inspiration from Gaia-X on the left for the way we declare things in the catalog, but also on the right here from the consent, we're taking basing ourselves on an ISO specification that I'll get into later on to have an alignment with recognized standards. And at the bottom, you see the data space participants that basically interact with the infrastructure services, but also amongst themselves for the data sharing based on the IDS Dataspace protocol transfer process for data exchange. That's all I'm going to say for now for this this image. We'll dive into each component in detail, but like that, you have an overview, a visual overview of what these components are and where they sit in the architecture. So these are exactly the building blocks that we're going to talk about today. So on the governance, we have these reference models, which I was talking about just before, which is where we're going to be defining all of these models that are going to be reused in the infrastructure. And then in the infrastructure, so we have this catalog registry. And the catalog registry is essentially an instance of these reference models that are going to be tailored for a specific data space. So this is why there's two blocks of the same components here, is because we can have several data spaces that based themselves on the same reference models, but with a catalog registry that is tailored for that data space. And directly under that, you have the three building blocks: consent, contract, and catalog. But this can be any n amount of instances of consent, contract, and catalog within a single data space. And at the bottom, so you have the adoption. Well, it can have many labels, but the adoption integration from participants, which is the data space connector, which is the entity and the component that participants themselves need in order to take part and communicate with the data space, but within themselves as well. So talked about the catalog registry a little bit already, just to round corners a little bit. So the reference models that are from Prometheus-X is an open source GitHub repository. So it's open to contribution. It's based on use cases from participants, and it defines all of these models that can be reused everywhere. Then the catalog registry is one of these components that any participant can instantiate as an infrastructure provider to enable the catalog services and contract services within the data space to have an alignment with the models and schemas that are defined in these reference models. Good thing is that this catalog registry is synchronized regularly with the reference models, but it's customizable to any specific needs of a dataspace. And then from the catalog registry, which is essentially a small application with a REST API, but a whole database of all these these models, it's very easy to provide these models to the different services, such as the catalog and contract, that reuse them extensively for configuration of assets, configuration of resources, policy configuration, etc. So let's dive into the catalog, which is one of the most important components, because this is where the participants are going to be onboarded into the dataspace. Essentially, the catalog is a REST API, so it's very simple to use. But this also means that as it being a REST API, it's easy to build interfaces on top of it to simplify adoption for participants. But it's the place where a participant will be able to come in, register data resources, software resources, create service offerings, take part in use cases, discover and browse a lot of what is going on inside of the dataspace. So it's essentially a metadata broker that is easily available for every participant. So as it being a REST API, it's a pretty direct and standard way to communicate with it. A participant usually will have a Prometheus-X dataspace connection to communicate with the Prometheus-X service. So there are two ways to communicate with it via API. One is through the dataspace connector, which proposes a lot of predefined and ready-to-use proxy connections to the different infrastructure services for the most used features. But as it's also a REST API, a participant will have some keys and credentials to communicate directly via the REST API to make some additional integrations if needed for the participant. But in the real world, and one of the implementations we have in Skills, it's easy to build interfaces on top of such a component. And this, for example, Visions Trust has built a catalog which enables to display information through a graphical interface to simplify adoption for participants to join the dataspace, but also all of the features, so register assets, manage their assets and offerings within the catalog. And yeah, this also enables the non-technical people from organizations to come in somewhere and not have an API-based way of communicating with the catalog to register things that are more business related, such as the pricing models, business models, etc., that usually exist in the negotiation or on the resources themselves. So one of the most essential things on the catalog is the ability to register and manage the resources. Here I've taken one of the an image from one of the implementation from Visions Trust, but of course, again, this is something that is available through the API of the building block. But it's basically the ability to provide different type of assets. So these are data resources, software resources, so APIs, etc. Service offerings, which are bundles of these resources, and the dataspace use cases, which is now defined in the Dataspace Support Center, which are basically ecosystems of different participants answering a similar use case. And what's good about registering assets in this catalog is that it automatically synchronizes with the participants connector. So the participants connector has a local catalog, which is his catalog of a metadata that is also available in the centralized catalog. And on top of this metadata you register in the catalog, you have also some technical metadata you need to provide, which is called resource representations right now. That is the way, basically, and the metadata that will be used by the connector during a data exchange process to know how to communicate with that resource to either push or pull data from and to that resource. So this is made simple through interfaces if the implementation has a graphical UI, but is also something available via API, but is an essential element of the metadata to add in order to make the data exchange happen, because it's necessary for the connector to know about this stuff. So I briefly mentioned it, and this is going to be making a transition towards the contract service. But one of the things that Prometheus-X is bringing to the table is this idea of Dataspace use cases. So a Dataspace use case is an ecosystem of participants within the Dataspace. It's usually orchestrated by one participant that has a project and creates this ecosystem that will go in the catalog, browse for participants and data sets and services that could be interesting for the use case. And it allows us to have a ecosystem level agreement between each and every member of the use case. This takes away the need to have unique bilateral contracts between each and every single member of the Dataspace use case in order to authorize data exchanges between members of the same use case. This basically helps tremendously in authorizing and managing data exchanges between members of a single use case. So this makes the direct link to the contract, because the contract has this type of contract as well that is handled within Prometheus-X. But so an overview on the contract service. What it enables is, of course, contract generation, the ability to handle both bilateral one-to-one contracts, but also ecosystem level contracts, the ability to have some policy injection, so configuring the different policies regarding assets within the contract, and of course, contract signature. It's composed of two elements. The contract manager is the base building block, which is where all of these basic features are present. And we are building also an ODRL manager library, which is the module that is going to be handling all of the ODRL related things, and such as policy management, the resolving of policy templates from the registry, and also running some policy enforcement when it's used within the connector. But so I was talking when mentioning the registry, I was talking about policy templates and rule templates. The registry is able to provide some templates for rules that are directly reusable when configuring resources and negotiating resources and assets with other participants. This means that it's very easy to configure for participants, and they don't need to redefine the whole ODRL structure of their policies whenever they're configuring a contract with other participants. So for instance, here we have an example where we have a policy that states it's a no restriction policy, so a very, very simple policy, but that requires basically some fields to be configured for a contract. And by working this way, we simplify the whole ODRL management for people that might have less knowledge and less information about how ODRL works. And it simplifies and streamlines the whole process of injecting actual policies inside of contracts that can then be verified and validated by the ODRL manager, but so the contract service and the Dataspace connector. So rule templates need to be configured. Here we have one implementation example of how this can work. Basically, when you're going to be registering an asset and a resource within the catalog, you're going to be defining what policies are going to be used for access control within during the data exchange process of that specific resource. And after you've done that, whenever you're going to be initiating a negotiation, contractualization process with another participant, you're going to be specifying the value of that the policy should follow. So for instance, here, there was the count policy, which states that the data must not be used for more than n times that was configured on a resource. And during the negotiation, then the provider of this resource is going to say, okay, the consumer cannot use this resource more than 10 times. And this is going to be then injected in the contract as the ODRL policy, and is going to be serving as the legal basis for the actual data exchange later on. So we have two types of contracts. We have the bilateral one-to-one contract between two participants on the usage of a resource for a specific purpose. And this purpose is usually a service or software or an API, for example. And it's a very simple process where there's going to be some a negotiation loop between the two parties to agree on how the policies can be configured for the usage of that resource. And following that, a very simple signature process to make the contract valid. And then we have the use case contracts, so the Dataspace use cases, where it's a little bit more complex, but it evolves around the same principle. The orchestrator of a use case is going to start by defining the roles and the rules for the participants in the use case. And then for each participant that wants to join the use case, they will be defining what resource they're going to be providing to this use case and under what conditions. And these conditions are basically the policies that apply to the resource they provide, and the negotiation happens between them and the orchestrator of the ecosystem to agree on how this resource is going to be used within the use case. In the end, the result is the same as for bilateral agreements. The policies that are agreed upon are injected in the contract, and after signature, the participants of that use case can use these contracts to enable data exchanges between them on the resources that are provided to this use case and are in the contract. Okay, so this was for contracts. It's a very simple process, right? But now we get into the more individual related things and the place of the individual in consent management within the architecture. And we start with this this image here that displays the place of the personal data intermediary, which is the component that enables the individual to communicate with the dataspace. And so we can see here where it sits within a dataspace in terms of how it communicates with the different components of a dataspace and the individual. This was made with the alongside the Dataspace for Skills initiative, but not to be mistaken that it's not because it was made for a skills initiative that it's not possible to have the same thing going on within any dataspace. So the PDI can be implemented in the similar way inside any type of dataspace and any needs that a dataspace can have. But here we see that the personal data intermediary is comprised of several components. The one that we'll be talking about today most is the consent, but it also has the modules about identity to manage identities within the different participants of the dataspace, a catalog, which is a B2C way of displaying data to the individual. But the consent management is the one that is the most interesting because it's what basically enables the user to control his data within the dataspace, but is also the information that is going to be passed around within the dataspace to trigger data exchanges, get information about the data that the user is going to be exchanging, etc., etc. So very briefly, just going to go over this one very quickly. The PDI catalog is a good component for the individual as it's a way for him to navigate around the dataspace and to make him know about what are the different data sets or services that could be interesting for his profile. It's based around the same elements as the catalog API specification. So it's based on the same standards, but it's just a different way of approaching it to be able to display this tailored for an individual. Now, the one that's the most interesting for us today is the consent management part. So the consent service is also a REST API, which means it's very easy to build some UIs for an individual on top of them. And it allows for everything regarding consent management. So enabling an individual to grant consent, to alter his consent, to revoke a consent, but also can act as a dashboard for individuals to have some information regarding how their data is used in the dataspace, by who, for what purpose, etc. And of course, this consent service has all of the mechanisms in place to enable and verify the consents, validate the consents during the actual data exchange protocols to ensure that a data exchange has been validated by an individual when it is concerning personal data. Yeah, just a quick word about the standards we're using for the consent. So we had started by working with and following the Cantera initiative's work, as it was a widely recognized standard for consent receipts. But then the ISO specification on the consent record information structure came out late August of last year, which incorporates a lot of the work done by the Cantera initiative. So now the consent service from Prometheus-X is also aligning with this ISO standard, which in the end makes a lot more sense anyways. So what does this all mean for the individual? As I said, the consent manager is a REST API. So that means that any implementation can build a UI for their users, for them to be for them to easily be able to do all of the actions regarding managing their consents in the Dataspace. This again is one example implementation from Visions Trust of a consent screen that can be displayed to an individual regarding a data exchange that can happen within the Dataspace. He can see, I think the left one is the most interesting for an individual, where he can see basically for what his data is going to be used, between which and which participant of the Dataspace, exactly what data is going to be shared, and a very simple way to say yes or no, I agree to my data being shared for that purpose. But we also have these different tabs, which are more in an educational purpose to teach the individual about more information on what data is going to be shared, the participant, have transparency for him to understand what's going on in the data space, and also a more legal aspect to it all, to understand really what his consent means, where his data is going to be stored, what exactly does it mean for his data to be shared, etc. But essentially, the most important for him is to have a simple interface where he can say yes or no to his data being shared. So in a more technical and architectural way of seeing things, the consent service is tightly coupled to the contract service, because in our ecosystem, a consent cannot be given if a contract does not exist between the participants who are going to be exchanging data. What this means is that it is mandatory for participants, so for a data provider, for instance, to go in the catalog, to declare a data set that concerns personal data, and for a data consumer to go in the catalog and to declare a service, a data processing service that concerns personal data, and for them to have a signed contract on the usage of said data for said service, in order for a consent to be then generated for an individual. So in this diagram here, you can see the individual communicating with his consent service. This means his PDI, but it's picked up by the consent service. And the consent service is going to be making verification of the existence on a contract before authorizing basically the individual to grant his consent for a specific data sharing between the two participants. Then what happens is that the consent service is going to be sharing the consent information to the Dataspace connectors to trigger the data exchange. And this is an important point I want to stop on right here. The infrastructure services and the consent service does not have any control on the and visualization on the actual user's data. The consent is only some metadata on the authorization from the user to allow a data sharing to happen. But as you see in this image, the data exchange happens directly between the two participants and is never relocated to the consent service in any way. So this is why the metadata broker, so the catalog, is important, and that the information on this metadata should be properly registered for it to be properly displayed to the individual, for him to understand what he's sharing, because the actual data is never visible by the PDI or the consent service. But yeah, so the Dataspace connector, I'll be diving into it just after, handles the consents and the contract, because it's also linked to the consents inside of the control plane. and then communicates with the data plane to actually make the data exchange happen. And the connectors are both related and plugged to the participants, either data store or application, to make this to pull or push the data. But yeah, so like that, you have an overview and a visual way of seeing where the consent sits within the participants. So now to go into the Dataspace connector. So Prometheus-X is building its own Dataspace connector. There are multiple reasons to that. The two most important are that we needed a way to handle personal data in consent, and none of the existing Dataspace connectors out there did that for the moment. And the other thing is that as we introduced the Dataspace use cases, we also needed a way to handle these types of contracts to authorize data exchanges. So the Prometheus-X Dataspace connector is a lightweight connector that is built around very common web technologies, essentially Node.js and a TypeScript, and enables the basic features for participants to communicate with the infrastructure services and in between themselves to actually make these data exchanges happen. A lot of talking, but so yeah. Here we can see an overview of the Dataspace connector in a very, very simple way for now, where you can easily see that the participants can have any technology stack and still have a Dataspace connector to interact with the infrastructure services. The thing is that what is very important to understand is that each participant that wants to take part in a data exchange needs to have its own instance of a Dataspace connector. This is because the Dataspace connector is basically some sort the identity of the participant within the dataspace, as it's how other parties in the infrastructure services are going to communicate with this participant. In terms of the components that comprise the connector, it's very simple. There are four main components. There's a public API for the connector, which is what the infrastructure services and the other connectors use to communicate with the connector. It has an administration API to allow for all of the different kinds of configuration that the connector can have. It has a Mongo database that can be external if necessary, that stores, and I'm going to repeat this afterwards, but that stores really only the configurations of the connector and some information about user management regarding consents, but it doesn't store data. So it's really just configuration database for the connector. And then there's a last component, a last module, which is the access control component that reuses this library of ODRL management to have the actual contract verification, policy enforcement, etc., whenever we're talking about the actual data exchanges. So let's jump into actual sequence diagrams to show how these all work for an actual data exchange. In this sequence diagram here, we assume that prior to this, there has been a negotiation and contract signed by the two participants for a data exchange. But if this contract exists, then we can have this kind of a sequence diagram and flow to work. The first one here that we're going to show is the B2B data exchange, which is basically the non-personal data exchange, which means that we see all of the actors we've been talking about, except for the individual and the consent. But for this organizational data exchange, so one of them is going to be triggering the data exchange, but it is always going to be the data consumer, so the connector of the data consumer, that is going to be initiating the actual data request by providing contract information on the data that should be shared for this process. There's then going to be some verification with the contract service on if the contract is valid, has properly been signed, and get the available policies. And there's an extra policy verification step at the level of the connector to enforce the policies that are defined on the resources that should be shared. And after that, we can finally get the data from the participants, either data source or application, and send it over to the data consumer's connector, which is also going to be sending it over to the participant's data source or application. And now for the more consent-driven data exchange. So it's essentially the same. Now we're just adding two actors. We're adding the individual and we're adding the consent service in all of this. And even though the bottom side, of the protocol is exactly the same, we're essentially just adding the top section, which is consent verification and a small protocol to ensure that consent is properly passed around by the participants before actually initiating the data exchange. What's the most important difference here being that without the individual's consent, we cannot have this data exchange happen. So what essentially happens is that the individual, through his personal data intermediary, is going to be granting his consent, which is going to be picked up by the consent service of the PDI. There's going to be some contract verification and then a small protocol to enable the two connectors to communicate with the consent and an access token to know that it's a personal data exchange and that it has been triggered by an individual. And at the end, the rest of the flow is exactly the same as I've presented just before. But what's important to keep in mind here for the consent-driven data exchange is really that without the individual's consent, you cannot trigger this data exchange flow. Yes, so just again, once more, when I was talking about the catalog before, I was talking about the technical metadata that should be registered on the resources and what we call the resource representation. And these are the information that is going to be used by the connector to over here, for instance, get the data from the participants and over here to push the data to the appropriate resource. So when we register assets and resources on the catalog, we need to inform this technical representation for it to be used within a technical data exchange. What this means is that a participant needs to set up an endpoint for where the resource lives. This can be either an endpoint where the data lives or an endpoint that should be receiving the data. It needs to set up, if there is some authentication to be used by the connector, what type of authentication is used. And it should then set up a credential identifier that is known only by its connector to be used during the data exchange protocol to authenticate to this endpoint. I'll go into the credential identifier just after. But this technical metadata is essential to be able to have this flow here to get the data and to push the data over here. So to go into a little bit more details about the credential identifiers, this is basically the way to allow for secure authentication to participant resources without making basically the authentication information public. Within participant's credential, the administrator within the administrator connector, the administrator can, through the admin API, configure credentials that are known only by his connector, which are going to be used then for a specific resource to authenticate to that resource. And it outputs basically a credential ID, which is what the participant needs to register within this information here for it to be used during the data exchange protocol. But so, again, this is only something that is known by the connector, and only the connector knows how to correlate the credential ID to an actual credential configuration, which can be any type of header and value of the header, or API key name and API key value, anything that can be used for authentication on resources. The connector has a very minimal configuration, so it's very easy to set up. Essentially, it has client ID and client secret that are provided when onboarded on the catalog, and then needs to know with what catalog, contract, and consent is going to be interacting in order to work within the Dataspace. So it's a very simple 5 or 6 fields to enter on a JSON file just before you set up and initiate your first connector. But then you're good to go, and this helps a lot with adoption to get started quickly. I'll finish up the connectors information with some info about user management. Because for participants that have an application with users and where these users have data, they need to be able to have a correlation between their users and the users that exist in the consent, so in the PDI. And for that, the connector enables some features to help the participants provide information about their users, which is going to be then registering this user within the consent service, providing what we call a user identifier, which is you may look at it as an identity card for one participant and an identity card for the user for one participant and one connector. And this identifier is then stored within the connector's database. So again, as I was saying earlier, the database of the connector is really for configuration purposes and the correlation of the user identifiers in the consent service. Never actually goes into storing any kind of data or anything. Okay, I'll finish up this section here by just saying that all of these components are open source, which means that they are all available on the Prometheus-X GitHub. And the documentation of all of these can be found within the repositories themselves directly or through the wiki of these repositories. So if you want to have a deeper look into these components, feel free to do so. We can only cover so much in 1 hour, especially when there are so much components to look into. But I think that now is a good time to open up a little bit the discussion. So we have prepared a mural. I don't know if someone has linked the URL to it in the chat. I'll share it if not. Right. So I just shared a link to a mural.
Felix,
yes,
there was also a question in the chat to see if we could do some kind of demo. I need to go right now, but do you think you can showcase maybe the catalog and the Visions Galaxy?
Sure.
Great.
All right. Yeah. So maybe we just we'll answer this question after the what I show on the mural. But yeah. So can you guys see the mural on my screen here? Yeah. Okay. So I'll go over it once, and then I'll show you the different questions we have for you guys. But essentially, this mural here represents how all of these components work together in a more architectural way, and this will be easier for you guys to give some feedback and thoughts about all of this. So I'll go over it quickly once. With the catalog, so we've seen that there's this standardization layer, which has two main components: the reference models, which is the open source repository that is powered by an open source community and the different use case that we're finding within Prometheus-X, but also with different partners, which are defining these different green blocks here, which are rules, roles, business models, etc., policy templates, but there's a lot more. And all of these are provided by catalog registries, which are an instance of this PDX catalog registry, which is the building block in the open source repository for this registry. This registry then provides to the catalog and the contract services the different models that can be reused. So within, so for the catalog, a catalog API instance is a direct instance of the PTX catalog API building block, which is again an open source repository. And it's where the Dataspace participants are going to be able to register and manage their different assets browse and discover the catalog and do all of the actions regarding the metadata broker and catalog in general. On the contract side of things, so we have these two components, these two building blocks. We have the contract manager, which is the core part of the contract management. We have contract manager instances, which are set up by infrastructure providers that want to provide a contract service within a data space, and that use as a dependency this OGRL manager building block, which is today a GitHub package, which is a library that can become an NPM package probably someday. And this is the component that enables the participants to handle negotiation, contract configuration, policy configuration, contract signature, and reviewing contracts and getting information on contracts and all of that. And of course, as I was saying, so we have, depending on the implementation, you might have some implementers, such as Visions Trust, that builds UIs on top of these services. And so Visions Trust, for instance, is a UI on top of the catalog and contract that helps to bridge the gap between the two to enable a GUI for participants to have easier access and easier time configuring their offerings, but also negotiating with other participants, configuring their policies, and having all of these contractualization aspects between them. And then within the consent part of things, so this is when we're talking about personal data. When we're talking about organizational data, this is not interesting, but consent has a direct link to the individual. The consent manager can be any number of instances of the PTX consent manager, which is the open source building block for the consent, and enables the different actions for managing his consent to the individual, but also provides a data usage dashboard and consent dashboard to the individual. But for organizations and for participation and for participants, it's also the component that's going to enable them to well, basically manage the different users that they might have in their application, generate privacy notices on top of which the consents are going to be given by the individual, and retrieve all kinds of information regarding consents for their users. Finally, at the bottom here, so I've just set up different ways that the connector can work for participants. So essentially, the connector can live on-premise or in the cloud for each participant. The only thing that's important is that each participant should have an instance of a connector for them. So in this first configuration here, well, basically, the Dataspace participant has their connector outside of their premises, but it communicates with the infrastructure of the participant, so the different data sets and services, thanks to the metadata that is registered on their resources in the catalog. On this other, but we can also have this other layout where participants can have the Prometheus-X connector on premise, which doesn't change at all the way that the connector communicates with it, but that's completely up to the participant to decide how they want to handle things. And just here to show quickly, we have, so this shows the very simple way that the connectors communicate with the different entities and between themselves. But so they communicate with the consent part to verify the consent, to be able to retrieve privacy notices for individuals. The consent communicates with them to provide consent information to trigger data exchanges, and they communicate with the contract usually to verify the validity of the contract, the status of the signature of the contract and different policies that exists, and then communicate within themselves with a simple data request, data transfer process, which is, and this I think answers one comment in the chat, based on the IDS transfer process that is defined in the IDSA Dataspace protocol. So yes, if we go back to this image I showed in the beginning, a lot of these are, and just answers to you, Matthias, a lot of these infrastructure services base themselves on the IDS Dataspace protocol specification, so on the catalog protocol, contract protocol, but also for the data transfer processes, it's directly based on the data transfer process defined in IDSA, and so handled by the Dataspace connector that we are building. And the Prometheus-X Dataspace connector is in the list of the IDS connector reports. So yeah, we are closely following the evolutions of IDSA and all of that. And yeah, we're trying to follow these specifications as much as we can. So this is mainly it. We have some questions already prepared here, but I'm open for other discussions if needed. We separated the questions in two topics. On the left side, we have basically the limitations and blocking points you might see within this architecture. And on the right side, more on how you would use, if you would use these building blocks, how you would use them, and if you have some specific projects that you would like to use these building blocks in architecture for. So what I would suggest is that I leave some time now for you to start entering some information on these post-its, and we can open up the discussion. I don't know if people can talk actually, but no. Okay. So if there are questions, please ask them in the chat, and I'll be answering them now. So. Do you plan to collaborate in the decentralized claims protocol? So I don't know yet. I believe so. If because we are looking into decentralization as one of the aspects to enhance all of this. Unfortunately, today we're not talking about identity because it's not one that we are directly in charge of. It's one other partner in Prometheus-X that knows more about this. But regarding identity, we're very interested in looking at decentralized options. So decentralization as a whole is going to be something we're going to be working towards for this architecture. Actually, in the meantime, so we had this question earlier about showcasing the use of the Dataspace connector. So I'm going to be showing the Visions Trust catalog as a demonstration. Which is, like I said before, one of the implementations here from Visions Trust of a catalog API, which is basically the building block from Prometheus-X. So this is the place where people are going to be, participants are going to be able to come in and get onboarded within the Dataspace and yeah, register basically all of their assets and information on their organizations, but also their resources, etc. I'm going to log into a test account here because I have some information I know in there. And so, yeah, so once you're in, basically, you can go and start defining resources and offerings. And so here I already have some demo resources because this is a test account we reuse a lot. But yeah, so basically we identify two major types of resources: data resources and services. Data resources are data sets. Services are data processing services, so APIs, data stores, etc. And when you're informing metadata for one of these resources, you're going to be informing this representation part, which is a direct link to how it works with the connector. Here I don't have any because it's an old one, but I can show you. For instance, for now, we're only handling REST in our implementation, at least. But so you could say that to access this resource during the data exchange process, the connector needs to use a REST protocol and call, I don't know, an example resource data, I don't know, one, for instance. This can call this endpoint to actually get the data. And let's say in my this endpoint needs to be authenticated through an API key credential communication. And in my connector, I have a credential identifier that has been generated for this resource that will be mapped with this credential identifier. When I register this information, once this information has been contractualized, this resource has been contractualized on and exists in the contract between two participants. If a contract is enforced to trigger a data exchange, then this information will be located inside it, and the participant's connector will know and be able to basically make the right calls to get the data or push the data to the right resource. So in this instance, we're on a data resource. So this is how the data connector is going to be able to pull data from this resource in order to then send it back to the actual data consumer. It's the exact same thing for a service, so a data processing service you're going to be registering, but it's just another way of thinking about it, where you're going to be setting the representation for a data processing service. So you're going to be setting where should this data be pushed, and does the connector need to have some kind of authentication to push the data inside of my resource. But so yeah, so this is the first, let's say, interaction between what you inform in the catalog and what the connector needs to know for a data exchange protocol. After that, so the catalog offers all of these functionalities for browsing, discovering different resources and entities. So here, our catalog is in a skills data space, so it's tailored for skills. We have a lot of data sets and services that evolve around skills. But as I said before, so yeah, sorry. One thing more, again, the different categories you see here are, for example, things that are provided by the catalog registry, because the catalog registry is tailored for our skills data space. But another data space could have their own instance of the catalog registry and have some data categories, service categories, etc., that are completely different and that correspond to their data space. This is one easy way to have different types of data space that have the same building blocks, but just configured differently in order to work with their needs and their data space. If I just go back, so just want to go back to this real quick to finish answering the question about the use of the dataspace connector and the different blocks. So each participant, again, needs to have their own instance of a dataspace connector. Actually, sorry, the one on the mural is much more self-explanatory. So each participant has their own instance of the connector. The connector is configured with this minimal configuration I showed earlier to communicate with the different infrastructure services, and the connector is going to be handling the data transfer between them, this participant, and another participant with a dataspace connector. So as a minimal use of the connector and the core building blocks, this is, I think, the best way to visualize it without getting too complex. Does your catalog follow the DCAT v3 format? So yes, we are actually, we at first no, and we have made the enhancements to be able to process DCAT v3, especially because we were missing this part of the alignment to the IGSA specification. And so now we have support for DCAT 3 within the catalog API. Okay. Is it planned to have a way to give consent on behalf of someone else? These are questions that I think are less technical than legal. And these are questions that have been asked and that we are also asking ourselves. I do not personally have the legal expertise to answer this question. I know this is something that we're looking into and that we, in the end, want to enable in a way. One of the building blocks that we have that are not yet ready, but that we are working on, is a consent agent, which would be a module that enables individuals to automatically handle their consent based on their preferences, etc. And so it has the same problematics as being able to delegate the consent, but all of these questions are, I think, more legal, but are things that we're looking into. Laszlo, I believe you had maybe some technical questions to ask from the participants.
I think basically what would be interesting for us is whether you are using any similar components and any similar standards in addition to those which were already mentioned, for instance, by Matthias in the chat.
Okay, so are there any issues that you see with the building blocks or the architecture? Any blockages on why you would not use this architecture? All of these are questions. I mean, if you have anything to say about this. Now, I think the participants of the call can now talk. But you can also add in your comments in the section of the mural. When will the webinar happen for the rest of the components? Laszlo, I think you had the dates for those.
Yes, sorry, I'm muted. I think for some components, they would be available soon. For instance, the visualization component is using a service which is already wrapped to be used as a building block here. Most of the building blocks will have a first version, I think, by September or November. I surely know, for instance, about data veracity, which we are developing. And I think all components will have a first version by the end of the year. And we are now developing not only the components or the blocks as individual blocks, but also these, let's say, composite service chains created of these blocks, which would be the next sort of specification and also testing phase for us.
Okay, just reading on the different questions that are asked in the mural. So I see one question about testing the interoperability with the EDC already. So this is a question that comes back a lot. The compatibility with the EDC connector is something we want to look into in the future. The thing is, right now, we took a different approach from the EDC because we wanted to handle consent management and these Dataspace use case contracts, which were not handled by the EDC. And so today, as we had to enhance the protocols for data exchange with the consent management and the management of these contracts, it is not directly interoperable. So this is a subject that we are going to be looking into in the future. But as of today, these are two different approaches, let's say.
Felix, can I raise my voice? Is
yes, please.
Yeah. I work for Catena-X, and Catena-X is a pure machine-to-machine communication and a B2B data space, and Prometheus-X, it's a B2C data space with human interaction. So by now it's clear there are totally different use cases. But when I see this industrial use case and the digital skilling use case, there are some use cases in between. Yeah, I would say some automotive companies, they want to also have the certifications from their suppliers if they are certified for specific certification from the staff. So I think to the maybe in a couple of years we will see let's say an interaction between Prometheus-X and Catena-X. Not now, but I think I would say these use cases will come soon. So then we have to think about how we can bring these two use cases together. And also mobility is something, it's industrial in one hand and is also human interaction as well. Yeah. So here we will meet together in the future. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. And I just want to say maybe it's also my fault today if I showed a little bit too much human interaction, but the components that we're building are do not require always a human interaction, right? They are set up to also work for machine-to-machine communication. So we're not limiting the use case to only B2C use cases. But yeah, of course, I believe these use cases will come close, and that we'll be talking in a close future.
Great, thank you.
I see another question in the chat about planning to use DID Web and VCVP and JSON-LD. JSON-LD is already used in the catalog, and especially because some of the specification, including the DCAT specification, etc., use them. The Gaia-X Trust Framework also used JSON-LD for the different models and how they are defined. Credentials and attestations from the Gaia-X Trust Framework have, were previously called self-descriptions, and these self-descriptions also use JSON-LD. So JSON-LD is something that we are already heavily using throughout the Dataspace. VCVP layer is something we are looking into because, yeah, we are going to be needing it for a lot of things, including identity. And so it's a very, very strong subject for us that will be explored in the near future. And same for DID Web, which is, I believe, already used a little bit in the identity identity building block. But again, I am not the expert on this subject.
Yeah, if I may just add that, yes, the identity is using the AD-Web. And for the VCVP, we are also planning to use a sort of VCVP for parts of the data itself by providing proofs for the quality of the data by the distributed data veracity assurance component. So this is another field or possibility to use VCVP within this overall architecture.
Yeah. Okay. No, I'm not seeing any new questions for now. So I think, does anybody have any general feedback, comments, or a question that they have in their mind? I think now is a good time to ask them.
Just to add that we received a question about whether we would share the presentation, and yet the presentation would be shared.
While we wait for it. Yeah.
I was able to come in and out. It's great to see all the work done, and it's really come far. So I'm Mark Lazar from the Pantera Initiative. I work on the notice and consent record standards for stuff. So I mean, it looks really, really good. You know, I would just say that we're looking at how Prometheus-X has consent management support. And I guess we look at a decentralized data governance, not where digital identity is governed by the law and defined by the law. So we have a different, also slightly different model in that we actually define the data space legally and then the technology accordingly instead of the other way around. So a lot of that, but the main thing is that there's a private, public, personal and what we call now the commons data space. And I think this common data space, this model sort of very much mirrors what we naturally have as humans in society and the way the sort of structures are set up. So we're really looking forward to introducing that later this summer.
Okay, that's very interesting. Mark, I'll probably contact you after the meeting because I believe we can have many subjects to talk about regarding consent management.
Yes, well, we have this one use case we're doing right now to test the architecture and standards we've been working on for a while, which is effectively to make a transparency index for using the standards, make a complaint in Quebec using the notice of consent law on the liability and the chain of the IAB transparency and consent framework. So we're basically looking at that as a way to interact and to look at the liability in the browser and to basically look at a way to implement like this policy architecture that we think would work well with Prometheus-X. So we've also put forward I mean, the idea is a consent internationally. So, but they start off with to basically, use a legal transparency and consent framework against the commercial transparency consent framework as a use case for regulators. So the idea, I think, is to present this to CNIL over the summer. That's really what we're looking at, and having this international transparency code of conduct that we present to them.
Okay, that would be very interesting. Yeah.
So we're looking for that type of discussion.
Sure. Okay, great. Well, we'll be in touch then.
Thanks.
Okay, I'm just gonna share the one last screen. So if you have any additional feedback post this session, so after this session, here are the ways to get in touch with us. The mural that I've shared will also remain open. So if you want to explore it a little bit further later on and give some more feedback and information and comments on it, please feel free to do so. And yeah, we have a little bit more than 5 minutes for extra questions if there are any. But otherwise, I think we are done.
Just a remark, as we received a question for the next webinars, there would be a next one in the middle of September, the 19th, and then we plan another one most probably at the end of October or early November to cover additional building blocks. And we will also share more technical information on our website.
If it's okay, I have yet another question. Thank you, by the way, for the presentation, and I really like that you addressed the question which I asked earlier about the DID web and VCVP and JSON-LD. Thank you for that. Yet another question is that are you having already a way to onboard a participant? And when I say a participant, I also mean even an individual, because we spoke about individual consent today. In one of the slides, you did cover that the participant will give details of the individual for the identity management as well as consent. But is there a way to onboard an individual, or just the participant informs?
So yeah, there are two. There is the way to onboard a participant today, which is either by a very technical means using the connector and plugging in it to a catalog, but also then this is why we have this implementation that with a graphical interface through the catalog that makes it easy for a new organization, a new participant to sign up and access the data space as a participant of the data space. In terms of individuals, this is what we were mentioning before about the personal data intermediary, which is this entity and component that aims to essentially bring individuals into the data space for them to control and manage their consents within the data space. So the PDI, the personal data intermediary, is going to be in the end an application that can exist either on the web or on an individual's device that that will be the way for the individual to be onboarded to this data space. And on top of that, there is another way to onboard individuals, which is through participants, because participants that share personal data might have use cases where they want to propose to their users of their applications to share their data for a specific purpose. I don't know. If we take in the skills example, we can imagine a data provider application that has some information about diplomas of users. And we have on the other side a data consumer, which is a job matching application. We can have a use case where these two participants want to enable their users to get some job recommendations based on their diplomas. So through the participants, the individuals can be onboarded to the data space because participants will be able to display consent screens to their individuals, which will directly link to a personal data intermediary, and then allow the individual to have an interface, a central interface and central application to manage the rest of these of his consents after this first one given. So we have different ways of onboarding the individual and organizations.
Great. Yeah. Thank you for that answer. Just a follow-up question, if it's okay. So in case of Gaia-X, just to draw a parallel, in case of a participant onboarding, registration number, a verifiable credential is required. So it could be, for example, an LEI code or a VAT ID. Is there something similar requirement for onboarding an individual, adding an individual? Because at some point, the individual needs an identification to begin with.
As of
Some
today,
document.
no. As of today, there is no need for an individual to have a specific reason to come to on board. Mostly because, and maybe we'll need to think about this later on. But in our use cases today, we're mostly looking at students in the skills, at least Dataspace. We were mostly looking at students or job seekers, etc., which are people that don't really. If we add some complexity on their onboarding, then they won't enter the data space and they won't start managing their consent. So we haven't had the need either legally or technically to verify this kind of information for individuals, but it could be an open question that we look into in the future.
All right. Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, I think this ends this session today. So again, on the screen, you have information on how to contact us. The mural will remain open for extra information if you need to look into it later on. The slides, I believe, will be shared as well. Thank you all for following. And Laszlo, if you want to say some last words.
Thank you, and let's keep in touch. You will receive the slides of the meeting and the recording and the recap, and let's see each other in our next series of webinars.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Night.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.